Protests spread across college campuses at home, even as most Americans continued to support the war.
The role of the left in the Vietnam War was, I think, the precipitating factor in our defeat. You had protests in the streets. It demoralized the troops. The series of protests led to the sense of defeat.
The U.S. continues to fight for its strategic objectives to stop the attacks on South Vietnam, stabilize the government, and advance ongoing peace talks in Paris. Meanwhile, President Nixon changes America's approach to the war, forcing Hanoi to the negotiating table.
I don't view Nixon as a hero, but I think he was one of our better presidents in foreign affairs. If you threaten something, you must do it, because otherwise nobody takes you seriously.
Welcome back. 1968 was a pivotal year for the war in Vietnam. Almost 17,000 American soldiers were killed, making it the deadliest year for America since the conflict began. The presidency of Lyndon Johnson was coming to an end, and 1969 began with the inauguration of a new president with impeccable anti-communist credentials, who pledged a different approach to the war.
The final hour of the outgoing president's term of office begins as Speaker of the House John McCormick escorts Mrs. Nixon and Mrs. Johnson from the White House to their waiting car. President Johnson leaves the White House for the last time.
I will faithfully execute the office
of President of the United States.
Of President of the United States.
When Richard Nixon took office, more than 500,000 U.S. troops were stationed in Vietnam. Since 1965, when American involvement had begun, some 31,000 American soldiers had died there. Nixon had run on the promise of withdrawing troops and achieving peace with honor in Vietnam. His strategy? Increased training and equipment for the South Vietnamese army in hopes that the Saigon government could take over its own defense, allowing American troops to withdraw. He called it Vietnamization.
The defense of freedom is everybody's business, not just America's business. And it is particularly the responsibility of the people whose freedom is threatened. In the previous administration, we Americanized the war in Vietnam. In this administration, we are Vietnamizing the search for peace.
But Nixon himself acknowledged that the North continued to receive massive support from the Soviet Union and China.
So we were supporting the South during the Vietnamization phase. Moscow and Beijing were supporting the North during the same time period. And whoever stopped supporting their ally first, they were going to lose.
This is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. Good evening. Our Moscow correspondent, William Cole, quotes informed Soviet sources tonight as saying that North Vietnam's Ho Chi Minh is dead.
On September 2nd, 1969, Ho Chi Minh died at the age of 79. The Stalinist ideologue who had been responsible for so much violence and death was felled by a heart attack. Russian specialists were brought in to embalm his body and place it in a tomb similar to that of his hero, Vladimir Lenin. Nixon would later call Ho a brilliant fraud who spent his life pretending to be exactly the opposite of what he really was. And although some felt Ho's demise might lead to progress at the negotiating table, he had ceased to be a factor in the inner circle of North Vietnamese leaders, and Hanoi remained intransigent.
Hell no, we won't go! Hell no, we won't go! Hell no!
At home, the anti-war movement gained momentum. And on November 15th of that year, 250,000 people marched down Pennsylvania Avenue to protest the war. Hundreds of thousands more attended anti-war events in cities across the country. On college campuses, protesters were portrayed not just as draft dodgers, but as social justice warriors. The Vietnam War was knitted into a larger anti-establishment agenda, fueled by college faculty, the elite press, and encouraged by Hanoi itself.
North Vietnam, as a Marxist regime, had always understood the importance of political warfare at the same time they engaged in the military warfare. It was always both. And they had 50,000 cadres focused on the political warfare. Virtually every captured document in South Vietnam that had political content was copied and sent to my desk. I spent hours reading them. I got a lot of insight into what the other side was thinking. From the very beginning, they knew they could not defeat the United States Army. We were a superpower. What they thought they could do, because it's what they had done with the French, they thought they could tie us down, inflict casualties, and then use propaganda to turn our people against the war. You need to understand, from the very beginning, political warfare was their primary game. They worked the American media brilliantly. They worked American college students. They had defeated the French through using propaganda telling the French people to oppose taxes for the war, tell your sons not to go to war, and so forth, and it had worked. The anti-war movement in France was strong, and they tried the same approach here for the same reason. It worked there, and it worked here.
Anti-war activists employed one phrase repeatedly, aimed directly at the young veterans who had served in Vietnam.
The American left and media used the term baby killer to turn the public and the international community against the war and against those of us who were soldiers fighting there. The reality was the communists chose to use kids as frontline saboteurs, suicide bombers, and spies in order to get us to react.
Outside the universities and the elite press, however, support for the war remained strong. From 1969 to 1972, the Gallup poll asked on 20 separate occasions, do you approve or disapprove of the way President Nixon is handling the situation in Vietnam? 18 of the 20 times, more Americans said they approved than disapproved. Though thousands of Americans were killed in action each year, the public still thought the war was worth that high price.
The problem with reading the polls about Vietnam is often the pollster would ask, do you approve of his conduct of the war? More than half of the people who disapprove would say, let's escalate the war, let's win the war. And so disapproval didn't mean, oh, they were doves, they wanted to pull out. In fact, a very small portion of the people who disapproved wanted to pull out. Most of them wanted to escalate the war.
For Vietnamization to work, Nixon believed the resupply of Northern fighters in the South would have to be stopped. The North had moved men, material, and ammunition through neighboring Laos and Cambodia for years along the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
One of the great failures in warfighting of the United States was the failure to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
The U.S. had bombed the trail from above, and while the thousands of air sorties had slowed down traffic, movement had never stopped. Further, the North had occupied portions of Cambodia and Laos as permanent bases from which to launch attacks on the South. It was a major strategic problem that Nixon hoped to correct.
In cooperation with the armed forces of South Vietnam, attacks are being launched this week to clean out major enemy sanctuaries on the Cambodian-Vietnam border.
There were a lot of people in the U.S. military saying we need to go into Laos and Cambodia and cut off these supply routes. We have since seen from the Soviets and the North Vietnamese stern admissions that this would have in fact been devastating to them.
The incursion into Cambodia lasted 2 months and was undertaken largely by South Vietnamese troops. Some 11,000 North Vietnamese fighters were killed, along with 388 Americans and 640 South Vietnamese. Nixon framed the operation as a test of American fortitude.
Small nations all over the world find themselves under attack from within and from without. If, when the chips are down, the world's most powerful nation, the United States of America, acts like a pitiful, helpless giant, the forces of totalitarianism and anarchy will threaten free nations and free institutions throughout the world.
Congress reacted immediately. Republican John Sherman Cooper and Democrat Frank Church introduced legislation to cut off funding of operations in Cambodia. Others proposed that all U.S. forces be withdrawn from Indochina by the end of 1971. Without congressional authority, they argued, expanding the war to Laos and Cambodia was illegal, a view that some legal scholars think is exactly backwards.
Under international law, if you're dealing with a neutral country, as Cambodia and Laos were, and the belligerent on the other side is using that territory, and the neutral is unable to stop that, there is every right under international law to go in as the other belligerent and to deal with that problem. So this was illegal on the part of North Vietnam to go in the first place, and it was perfectly lawful for the United States.
As a new decade began, Richard Nixon seemed to be at the pinnacle of world politics, with high approval ratings for a first-term president and bipartisan support for his plans for Vietnamization and the withdrawal of American troops. South Vietnam was increasingly calm, the countryside largely pacified. The war wasn't over, but the Viet Cong had not recovered from their defeat during the Tet Offensive. Massive U.S. support had propelled Vietnamization in the South, with positive results.
By 1970, the groundwork was laid to pacify South Vietnam. The forces of the North were devastated by then. We had shifted our tactics, adopting different techniques, more in the villages, on the ground, working with people. Fewer troops were in Vietnam, but there was more development going on and trying to get more buy-in from the people to maintain their own defenses and to, push out the communists.
I've worked with a lot of Vietnam veterans, and more than once I've heard, we were winning when I left, what happened? Over the years, I was in 42 out of 44 provinces in South Vietnam, plus Laos and Cambodia. The difference in security in the Mekong Delta between 1968 and 1971 was night and day. It was walking through Detroit or St. Louis in the middle of the night in a bad neighborhood versus walking in Charlottesville at noon. In 68, I almost always was armed with a round in the chamber. By 71, if I carried a weapon at all, it did not have a round in the chamber. It was just a matter of your sense of the danger. Yeah, people were still dying in 71, but I also was interviewing a lot of defectors and prisoners who were saying, we're getting killed at every point.
Nixon was pleased when he picked up the front page of the Sunday New York Times on June 13, 1971, and saw the picture of him escorting Tricia, his ethereal blonde daughter, as the paper described her, to her wedding in the White House's Rose Garden. Television coverage had been equally fawning, close to the kind received by his political rival, JFK.
Hey, that wedding was just great. Well, it was you got to give Pat and Tricia the credit. They really worked, and that White House staff, weren't they great? Everything was absolutely superb. And I thought the press coverage was excellent. The TV was really, you didn't see it probably. I saw some of it. I thought it was great. It was really came out. All three networks did it. Just really couldn't have done better. I don't know how you could have done any better. I mean, there was no snide remarks or anything. Just great. Really handled it well. It couldn't have been better.
But a second headline on the front page would come to haunt the Nixon presidency. It read, Vietnam Archive. Pentagon study traces 3 decades of growing U.S. involvement. The article went on to describe the trove of leaked documents that we know today as the Pentagon Papers. The documents were in fact part of a classified history of Vietnam commissioned by the Defense Department. In more than 7,000 pages, the study focused on the decision-making of 4 U.S. presidents, ending with LBJ, who the Times accused of systematically lying to the public and Congress. It was quickly termed a secret history and gained further notoriety when the Nixon administration obtained a federal court injunction against its publication, a decision that the Supreme Court quickly overturned. The drama surrounding the publication of the Pentagon Papers obscures the fact that most of the actual information included in the report was already known. Congress did not hold hearings, no one was charged with a crime, and since its chronology stopped at 1967, it said nothing about Nixon or his conduct of the war.
The biggest revelation to come out of the Pentagon Papers issue is that nobody in Washington read them. I actually sat down and read them, and I found they shot down virtually every argument being used by the anti-war movement. Well, I think it was misinterpreted in part because there were people who had an agenda. They were trying to end the war, and the good guys were too busy to bother to read them. And they were told, oh, they showed that so-and-so lied about this and so forth, and we must get into damage control and stop it. And in fact, what they should have done is read them and go out and say, last week you heard Senator Fulbright say this. Well, actually, the Pentagon Papers show he's wrong, and here's why. We could have turned that into a victory had anybody bothered to read the damn things.
Nixon certainly could have weathered the revelations about his predecessor's conduct of the war. In June, his approval rating still hovered around 50%, respectable for a president looking toward re-election.
I liked Nixon. He had flaws, but I liked him. But he did not understand what was in the Pentagon Papers. He read excerpts that took a few out-of-context terms, and he thought they were basically a hatchet job that would undermine his war effort. I think it was a perfectly reasonable position, and the only better solution would have been for somebody to take the time to read somebody who understood the history, to take the time to read the papers and to tell him, hey, Mr. President, there's some embarrassing stuff here about Kennedy and LBJ and Westmoreland, but the overall war effort is supported tremendously by documenting this was, in fact, an aggressive war, and that we were right to go to the aid of the victims.
The only answer to communism is a massive offensive for freedom. Freedom from hunger, from disease, and a victory for the ageless hope of people everywhere. Freedom from tyranny.
Because Nixon had become a national figure in the 1940s as the leading anti-communist in the House, it was a jaw-dropping moment 22 years later when he embarked on an unprecedented mission to Beijing. The trip launched a new era in U.S.-China relations and revealed a broad rethinking of Cold War strategy by Nixon, who was now willing to communicate and cooperate with both China and the Soviet Union.
I want to express my very deep appreciation to all of you who have come here to send us off on this historic mission.
Nixon hoped that he could reframe relations between the U.S. and its communist adversaries through a combination of arms control agreements, trade deals, and cultural exchanges. At the same time, he perceived a growing rivalry between China and the Soviet Union and looked for opportunities to drive a wedge between the two. One of his major goals was to curb both countries' support for North Vietnam.
Our talks have been characterized by frankness, by honesty, by determination, and above all, by mutual respect.
He offered Beijing what would become known as the One China policy, a promise that, quote, all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait is but one China, and that Taiwan is a part of China. Nixon's promise of a single China would become a linchpin of U.S. policy in Asia and put in motion a 50-year campaign by Beijing to take control of Taiwan.
The Soviets and Chinese were at this point not especially interested in North Vietnam prevailing. There had been this falling out between the North Vietnamese and the Chinese, and the Soviets didn't want to antagonize the Americans more than they needed to. But North Vietnam did get enough military assistance to do what it needed, and South Vietnam did not. And clearly, the United States was not a reliable ally.
On March 30th, 1972, North Vietnam launched a full-scale invasion of the South, sending 120,000 troops across the border.
For the past 25 years, North and South Vietnam have been at war. And for the past 10 years, America has been doing the South's fighting for it. But those days are now over. In this, the latest North Vietnamese offensive, the South Vietnamese army are standing on their own feet.
The South Vietnamese army responded well, giving hope to those who had pushed for Vietnamization.
I kept hearing people say, oh, the South Vietnamese are all cowards. I watched enough of them die to be offended by that. You know, we went over there mostly on one-year tours. We could play John Wayne a little bit and get our medals and come home. And if we did get injured, there was going to be a medevac bird there to take us back to the hospital. Our odds were so much better than in most battlefields in history. But I thought the South Vietnamese more than acquitted themselves, and that they deserve being honored for that courage.
Nixon responded to the attack with renewed bombing of the North, an air campaign the Pentagon dubbed Linebacker 2. In addition, Nixon sought for the first time to halt the resupply of North Vietnam by sea, mining Haiphong Harbor on the Gulf of Tonkin.
Nearly all of the weaponry and industry coming into North Vietnam is coming from China or from the Warsaw Pact countries. And without that, they clearly could not have survived for long. They are getting it through rail from China and also through the sea. Eventually, President Nixon in the 72 bombings will finally mine the North Vietnamese ports, something that had been contemplated for a long time. And the combination of that and bombing of railroads does in fact have a lot more impact than people had expected.
The mining of the Haiphong Harbor brought the North Vietnamese to the negotiating table in a matter of weeks.
Official U.S. Navy films show our jet fighter bombers plastering North Vietnam communication and boat repair facilities.
Linebacker 2 really got Hanoi's attention. It was the first time we had played like we were a superpower. We had hit them hard. The guys, I have several friends who were in the Hanoi Hilton, and they talk about all of a sudden the guards became very solicitous of their welfare and brought them coffee in the morning. And they had one look in the face of any guard's eyes, they knew the war was over, they had lost. And so Hanoi, essentially, as I understand it, said, what do we have to sign to stop the bombing? Because they had fired all of their supply of SAM-2 missiles. They were totally vulnerable. And we still had our B-52s and could have pounded the hell out of them.
I was at that time the counselor on international law to the Department of State. And I watched and talked to my colleagues who were with Henry Kissinger at the Paris Accords. And prior to that, there was very little movement on the part of North Vietnam. And when that happened, in a matter of weeks, the war was basically over. And that could have been done at any time during the war.
The number of Americans killed in action dropped precipitously, to 641 in 1972. That November, Nixon won an historic victory.
I've never known a national election when I would be able to go to bed earlier than tonight.
He carried 40 of 50 states and won 60% of the popular vote. His second term began with an equally historic announcement.
I have asked for this radio and television time tonight for the purpose of announcing that we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia.
4 years and 3 days after Nixon first took office, the American war in Vietnam was finally over. Following the speech, Gallup asked one more time about Nixon's handling of the war. 75% approved. Henry Kissinger and Le Duc Tho would win the Nobel Peace Prize for their role in the Paris Accords and for jointly negotiating a ceasefire in Vietnam. But in truth, the war was far from over, and for the Vietnamese, some of the deadliest fighting was yet to come. Join me for the conclusion of our series as we look at how a scandal in Washington led to devastating consequences for South Vietnam and all of Southeast Asia. That's next time on the Unauthorized History of the Vietnam War.